When Italian bombers dropped mustard gas on Ethiopian villages in 1936, one man walked into the League of Nations and delivered a prophecy the West would soon regret ignoring. Haile Selassie survived that war, but not the revolution waiting at the end of his reign. In the highlands of Harar province, where ancient stone churches cling to cliffsides and monasteries guard secrets older than memory, a child entered the world on July 23, 1892. His father Ras Makonnen governed these eastern lands with an iron will, cousin to the great emperor Menelik II, who had humiliated Italian invaders at Adwa just 4 years later. The boy Tafari learned French before he learned to ride, studied European maps while other children played, absorbed his father's lessons about power and patience, and the long game of survival. Ethiopia, alone among African nations, had never bent to colonial masters. And young Tafari understood this was no accident, but the product of cunning and strength passed through generations claiming descent from Solomon himself. Then in 1906, his father died, and everything changed. 13 years old, small for his age, the boy stood at the funeral surrounded by towering nobles whose eyes measured his inheritance like wolves circling wounded prey. Emperor Menelik placed a weathered hand on his shoulder and spoke words that would echo through decades. "Your enemies will underestimate you. Let them." The child said nothing. He had already learned that silence was its own kind of weapon, that patience was the deadliest blade. He watched the nobles watching him, and filed away each face, each hungry glance, each whispered calculation. He would remember, he would wait, he would outlast them all. And now, before this story unfolds further, may I take a small portion of your time and subscribe to this channel. Join thousands of history lovers on this journey through time. If this tale has earned your attention, a like and a comment go a long way. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? These stories have traveled centuries to reach you. Let us continue. Addis Ababa, in those years, was a city caught between centuries. Corrugated iron roofs glinting beside ancient churches, where priests chanted in Ge'ez and incense smoke carried prayers toward heaven. The orphaned Tafari navigated this world with preternatural care, accepting the governorship of Sidamo at 14, as others might accept a death sentence, then claiming Harar itself at 17, returning to rule the province his father once held. He married Menen Asfau in 1911, binding himself to bloodlines that traced back through centuries of Ethiopian nobility, and around him he gathered young men who dreamed dangerous dreams of telephones and railways and schools where peasant children might learn to read. Emperor Menelik suffered stroke after stroke, while his grandson Iyasu prepared to inherit. But Iyasu was erratic, drawn to Islam and the Ottoman cause, even as the great powers of Europe tore themselves apart in war. Tafari read French newspapers in his study, corresponded with diplomats who saw in him something useful, and cultivated the image of reason amid chaos. He visited the European legations where telegraph machines chattered secrets, and ambitious men traded whispered intelligence over imported wine. When Menelik finally died in 1913 after years of living death, Iyasu seized power and immediately began burning bridges with the Orthodox Church, with the Christian nobles, with everyone Tafari had spent years quietly courting. The young governor watched from Harar as the heir apparent made enemy after enemy. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply prepared, knowing that power rarely went to those who grabbed for it, but almost always to those who waited. On September 27, 1916, the Orthodox bishops gathered in righteous fury and pronounced the unthinkable, excommunicating Iyasu for his embrace of Islam and his dangerous flirtation with Ottoman power while Europe burned in war. Tafari moved with the precision of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh, allying himself with Empress Zewditu, daughter of the great Menelik, and the conservative nobles who saw their Christian nation slipping toward apostasy. The coup succeeded, and Zewditu took the throne while Tafari became Ras and regent, the power behind the empress. Tradition and modernity bound together in uneasy partnership. He consolidated control over foreign affairs and policy, while Zewditu embodied the ancient ways. And in 1923, he achieved what had seemed impossible, steering Ethiopia into the League of Nations as proof that this African kingdom deserved its place among civilized states. The following year, he sailed for Europe, the first Ethiopian ruler to venture abroad, and in Paris he posed for photographs in formal European dress, while in London he shook hands with King George V and toured factories and hospitals and schools. He saw wonders he would bring home to his people. But he also saw the truth behind European smiles, the way their eyes measured African resources like merchants appraising cattle at market. Aboard the ship returning home, Tafari wrote in his journal what he could never speak aloud. These powers preached peace and progress, but dreamed of empire. Ethiopia's survival depended on playing their game so perfectly they could find no excuse to devour her. He would give them none. Addis Ababa, by the late 1920s, had become a city of jarring contrasts, where automobiles honked at mule trains and telephones rang in government offices built beside thatched huts. The uneasy partnership between Empress Zewditu and her regent had grown brittle with tension, and in 1928, Tafari forced the issue, elevating himself to Nigus, king, co-ruler in title with the woman he had long overshadowed, in fact. Conservative nobles launched a desperate coup that same year, but his forces crushed them without mercy, and when Zewditu died on April 2, 1930, officially from illness, though whispers of poison would never fully fade, nothing stood between Tafari Makonnen and the throne of Solomon. On November 2, 1930, the world witnessed a coronation unlike any Africa had ever seen. Foreign dignitaries from 40 nations crowding into Addis Ababa, the Duke of Gloucester representing Britain, princes and ambassadors jostling for position as ancient Ge'ez liturgy blended with European ceremony. He received the crown, the orb, the scepter, and the ring, and the priests proclaimed him Haile Selassie, power of the Trinity, King of kings, Lord of lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God. In Jamaica, followers of Marcus Garvey remembered their prophet's words about a black king crowned in Africa, and the Rastafari movement stirred to life. That night, Haile Selassie stood on his palace balcony, watching fireworks paint the sky, while across the Mediterranean in Rome, another man watched newsreels of this African emperor, and Benito Mussolini began dreaming of vengeance for Adwa. The newly crowned emperor threw himself into transformation with furious energy, building schools where children learned to read, and hospitals where modern medicine battled ancient diseases, and roads that carved through mountains to connect his scattered kingdom. In 1931, he unveiled Ethiopia's first written constitution, a document that appeared democratic to foreign eyes while granting him near absolute power, and he worked to centralize authority in Addis Ababa, weakening the regional lords whose loyalty depended on their autonomy. He proclaimed the abolition of slavery under international pressure, though the practice persisted in distant provinces where imperial decrees arrived as faint whispers. These were the contradictions that would haunt his reign. For he wanted modernity without democracy, educated citizens who would not question, foreign investment without foreign control. Meanwhile, the world beyond Ethiopia's borders grew darker by the year. The Great Depression strangled global economies while Japan invaded Manchuria, and the League of Nations proved itself a paper tiger, all bluster and no teeth. In Rome, Mussolini watched and calculated, massing troops in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, manufacturing border incidents, demanding apologies for imagined offenses. Haile Selassie sent emissaries across Europe seeking modern weapons, but nation after nation refused, unwilling to arm an African state against a European power. Then, in December 1934, at the Walwal Oasis, Ethiopian and Italian troops clashed, and men died in the dust, and Italy demanded reparations with the tone of a man spoiling for a fight. The emperor understood with cold clarity that this was pretext, not provocation. The invasion he had feared was no longer coming. It was already here. At the Walwal Oasis on December 5, 1934, Italian Somali troops who had illegally occupied wells deep inside Ethiopian territory opened fire when Ethiopian forces arrived to investigate. And when the shooting stopped, approximately 150 Ethiopians and 50 Italians lay dead in the sand. Mussolini had been planning this moment since at least 1932. Manufacturing a crisis with demands for impossible concessions he knew would be refused, and Haile Selassie responded with the weapons he believed in most, appeals to international law and the League of Nations he had worked so hard to join. Throughout early 1935, he pleaded his case in Geneva, while Britain and France calculated coldly that they needed Italy against Hitler, and an African nation was an acceptable price for European security. The emperor offered extraordinary concessions, humiliating compromises that would have given Italy nearly everything short of sovereignty. But Mussolini wanted conquest, not negotiation. Haile Selassie sent agents across the world seeking weapons, but found doors closed everywhere, and so he mobilized what he had, hundreds of thousands of warriors answering the ancient call to arms, most carrying spears and antique rifles against an enemy bringing tanks and aircraft and poison gas. On October 3, 1935, without declaration of war, 400,000 Italian troops poured across the borders from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. That night, the emperor addressed his nation by radio, his voice steady despite everything. "Our ancestors died rather than submit," he told his people. "We shall do the same." In Rome, Mussolini boasted victory would come in weeks. In the mountains of northern Ethiopia, where terrain had swallowed invaders for millennia, the warriors of the empire made their stand against the Italian onslaught. General de Bono pushed south from Eritrea, but found progress agonizingly slow, the Ethiopians exploiting every ravine and cliff face, striking supply lines and vanishing like ghosts into landscapes they had known for generations. Each Raz commanded his own forces with varying degrees of loyalty and coordination, a feudal army facing a modern war machine. Yet in December 1935, the Christmas offensive pushed the Italians back in several sectors, and for a brief, shining moment, victory seemed possible. Then came the gas. Italian aircraft swooped low over Ethiopian positions and released clouds of iperite, mustard gas that burned through skin and blinded eyes and destroyed lungs from within. Men who had never imagined such horror writhed in agony while their comrades watched helplessly, possessing no gas masks, no understanding of what invisible death descended upon them. The Italians sprayed poison on Red Cross camps and bombed medical facilities and dropped canisters on villages where women and children fled with blistering flesh. Ras Imru watched his soldiers die screaming and could offer them nothing but prayers. International reporters documented the atrocities, and the world expressed concern and did nothing of consequence. Haile Selassie traveled to the northern front in military uniform, rifle in hand, photographed for images that would become iconic, attempting to coordinate armies that answered to regional lords as much as to their emperor. By February 1936, The tide had turned irreversibly. Italian firepower and air superiority and chemical weapons overwhelming courage and terrain alike. And the emperor faced a choice no man should have to make. On the plains of Mechu on March 31st, 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie personally commanded 31,000 Ethiopian troops in a final desperate gamble against Badoglio's entrenched forces. The assault began before dawn, with warriors surging forward through the darkness. But as daylight broke, so did the slaughter. Machine guns cut down wave after wave, while artillery shells exploded among the charging men, and aircraft screamed overhead, strafing the living and the dying alike with bullets and mustard gas. By nightfall, the Ethiopian army was shattered, thousands dead upon the field. The survivors scattered into the mountains in disarray. The emperor retreated to Addis Ababa, but organized resistance had collapsed across the nation as feudal lords surrendered or fled with whatever treasures they could carry. On April 30th, a council of nobles gathered to debate their emperor's fate, some demanding he die gloriously in battle, as befitted the Lion of Judah, while others argued he must survive to plead Ethiopia's cause before the world. On May 2nd, Haile Selassie made his choice, boarding a train for Djibouti with his family and a small entourage, while behind him Addis Ababa descended into chaos, looting and violence consuming the capital as order disintegrated. 3 days later, Italian troops marched into the city, and Mussolini proclaimed the founding of Italian East Africa. From the deck of a British ship in the Red Sea, the emperor watched Africa's coast fade into haze. He had lost his throne, his country, perhaps his honor. Some would call this cowardice. He called it strategy. He still had his voice, and he intended to make the world listen. On June 30th, 1936, a small bearded man in a black cape walked to the podium at the Palace of Nations in Geneva, while Italian journalists in the gallery whistled and jeered and shouted insults until guards expelled them, though their contempt lingered like poison in the air. Haile Selassie spoke in Amharic, a deliberate choice emphasizing the sovereignty these assembled nations had failed to protect, and he described in devastating detail the mustard gas raining from aircraft, the bombed hospitals, the civilians murdered by a power that called itself civilized. Delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats as his words struck like hammer blows, and some openly wept, while others stared at their hands in shame. "It is us today," he declared into the silence. "But it will be you tomorrow. What answer am I to take back to my people?" The answer came soon enough when Britain and France led the vote to lift sanctions against Italy, choosing appeasement over justice, European security over African lives. In that chamber, the League of Nations died as an effective body, though it would shamble on for years as a hollow corpse. Within 3 years, Hitler would invade Poland, and the prophecy would prove exact. The emperor settled in a modest house in Bath, England, a symbol of resistance to fascism, but a man without a country, his family struggling with the indignities of exile, while reports reached him of Italian atrocities reshaping his conquered homeland. He kept a map of Ethiopia on his wall, and marked each massacre as news arrived. He waited, he planned. History would vindicate him if he lived long enough to see it. The years in Bath passed slowly for the exiled emperor, modest circumstances replacing imperial grandeur. Constant lobbying met with polite indifference from British officials who still hoped to avoid war with Italy. He wrote letters that went unanswered and gave interviews that changed nothing, and met with diplomats who nodded sympathetically before returning to more pressing concerns. Meanwhile, reports reached him of horrors unfolding in his occupied homeland. In February 1937, after an assassination attempt on Viceroy Graziani, Italian forces unleashed the Yekatit 12 massacre, slaughtering an estimated 19,000 to 30,000 Ethiopians in Addis Ababa over 3 days of systematic murder. Yet resistance continued as Arbegnau's guerrilla fighters harassed Italian forces throughout the countryside, refusing to accept conquest even as their emperor waited helplessly an ocean away. His health suffered in the English damp, and his children struggled with displacement and diminished status, but he refused to accept defeat, maintaining that an emperor in exile remained an emperor still. The world lurched toward catastrophe as Hitler annexed Austria and devoured Czechoslovakia and finally invaded Poland. But still the British kept their distance from the embarrassing reminder of their appeasement. Then on June 10, 1940, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, and everything changed. Within weeks, the same officials who had ignored Haile Selassie for years were requesting urgent meetings. He received them with the dignity of a monarch and the memory of an elephant, agreeing to help reclaim his throne while filing away every slight for future consideration. He would cooperate. He would not forget. In Khartoum, in June 1940, British officers who had ignored him for years now sat across the table requesting his help, for Italian forces in East Africa threatened their positions, and the exiled emperor's prestige could rally Ethiopian resistance as nothing else could. Haile Selassie traveled to Sudan and began broadcasting radio messages calling his people to rise against their occupiers, his voice crackling across the airwaves into villages and mountain hideouts where patriots had never stopped fighting. In January 1941, he crossed back into Ethiopia with a small force accompanied by the eccentric British officer Ord Wingate and his irregular Gideon force, and as word spread that the emperor had returned, Italian morale began to collapse. The campaign combined British military action with Ethiopian guerrilla uprising as Arbegnau's fighters, who had harassed the occupiers for 5 years, emerged from the highlands to join the liberation. At the Battle of Keren, British forces shattered Italy's strongest position, while Ethiopian guerrillas liberated territories ahead of the advancing armies. Then, on May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years to the day after Italian troops had entered his capital, Haile Selassie rode back into Addis Ababa. Church bells rang across the city as crowds wept and cheered for the Lion of Judah returned from exile. But the victory was bitter with loss. Perhaps 500,000 Ethiopians had died under occupation. Infrastructure lay destroyed, and British troops now filled the streets as liberators expecting reward. Standing on his palace balcony addressing his nation, the emperor spoke of sacrifice and survival and rebuilding. He did not mention the British officers already negotiating their advisory role in Ethiopian affairs. One occupation had ended. Another negotiation was beginning. Ethiopia, in 1941, was a nation liberated but not free, for British forces controlled the railways and finances and foreign policy under the Anglo-Ethiopian Agreement of 1942, while their officers advised and supervised and expected permanent influence as the price of liberation. Haile Selassie accepted these humiliations with patient calculation, playing British interests against American ambitions, positioning Ethiopia as a loyal fascist ally, deserving full sovereignty rather than colonial tutelage. He purged collaborators who had served the Italians while strategically pardoning nobles whose usefulness outweighed their treachery. And he placed himself at the center of every reconstruction effort, ensuring loyalty flowed to his person rather than to institutions that might someday challenge him. Schools and hospitals and courts rose from the ruins, but all roads led to the palace. He contributed Ethiopian troops to Allied campaigns in North Africa and Burma, traveled to meet Roosevelt and Churchill as an equal rather than a supplicant, and pressed relentlessly for the return of Eritrea, the former Italian colony now under British administration that he considered rightfully Ethiopian. He began sending young Ethiopians abroad for education in America and Europe, and even the Soviet Union, building a generation of modernizers who would transform the nation. At home, he centralized power absolutely, the reformer revealing himself as autocrat, tolerating no challenge to imperial authority. By 1945, Britain agreed to withdraw, and Ethiopia stood sovereign once more. Haile Selassie had achieved the impossible, losing his country and winning it back through patience and cunning and will. Now he faced the harder task of holding it together. In the post-war world of crumbling empires and rising nations, Ethiopia claimed its place as Africa's elder statesman, a founding member of the United Nations in 1945. The continent's only independent voice among the great powers. Haile Selassie cultivated relationships with Eisenhower and Khrushchev and leaders across the ideological divide, projecting Ethiopia as the model of African stability and progress while positioning Addis Ababa as the natural capital of African unity. In 1952, a UN compromise federated Eritrea with Ethiopia, a halfway measure the emperor intended to make permanent, and his revised constitution of 1955 projected democratic modernity while preserving imperial power intact behind the elegant language. His international stature lent legitimacy to African independence movements as colonized peoples looked to Ethiopia as proof that African self-governance could succeed. Yet, beneath the constitutional rhetoric, the domestic reality remained medieval. Feudal structures persisted as land stayed locked in the hands of nobility and the Orthodox Church, while peasants remained bound to masters in conditions that differed from slavery only in name. Modernization transformed Addis Ababa with universities and ministries and paved boulevards, while the countryside languished in poverty, unchanged for centuries. The young Ethiopians the emperor sent abroad for education returned with dangerous ideas about democracy and land reform and social justice, grateful for their opportunities but impatient for changes that never came. At the dedication of a new university bearing his name, Haile Selassie spoke eloquently of progress and Ethiopian greatness, while in the audience a young officer named Mengistu Haile Mariam listened intently. He was not yet 20. He had not yet dreamed of revolution, but he would. On December 13, 1960, while Haile Selassie conducted a state visit in Brazil, the Imperial Guard seized his palace in Addis Ababa and took Crown Prince Asfa Wossen hostage. The coup leaders were brothers, Mengistu Niue, commanding the Imperial Guard, and Germame Niue, the intellectual radical who had long dreamed of transforming Ethiopia into a modern democracy. They forced the Crown Prince before microphones to read a statement endorsing reform, promising land redistribution and an end to corruption and democratic government for a people who had known only imperial rule. But the army and air force remained loyal to the absent emperor, and when Haile Selassie flew back immediately, the counter-coup began with brutal efficiency. Loyal forces bombarded the palace while the Niue brothers fled, but before escaping, they executed 15 hostages, including former prime ministers, ensuring their revolution would be remembered in blood. Mengistu Niue was captured and hanged, while Germame died fighting in the countryside. The emperor returned triumphant, but shaken beneath his impassive exterior, making minimal reforms, shuffling cabinets, offering vague promises while leaving the fundamental problems of land and democracy and corruption untouched. The failed coup had revealed something terrifying, that opposition existed within the educated elite he himself had created. His circle of trusted advisors shrank as suspicion grew. At ceremonies following the crisis, Haile Selassie showed no emotion, but those who knew him detected something new in his ancient eyes, not fear, but cold calculation. He had survived again. He had also learned that his greatest threat might be his own creation. On May 25, 1963, 32 African heads of state gathered in Africa Hall in Addis Ababa to sign the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, while Haile Selassie presided as the founding father of continental solidarity. It was his greatest triumph, positioning Ethiopia as the diplomatic capital of Africa, with the OAU headquarters permanently in his capital, establishing himself as the elder statesman who mediated disputes between newly independent nations still finding their footing. His international stature reached its zenith in these years as he conducted state visits to Kennedy's Washington and Khrushchev's Moscow and de Gaulle's Paris, gracing the covers of Time magazine and receiving nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize too. In Jamaica, the Rastafari movement venerated him as the returned Messiah, fulfilling Marcus Garvey's prophecy of a black king who would deliver his people. Yet, while the emperor collected honors abroad, Ethiopia stagnated at home. Land reform remained blocked by the nobility who controlled the countryside. The Eritrean independence movement turned violent as rebels fought the annexation he had imposed. Students and intellectuals grew openly critical, distributing pamphlets demanding changes that never came. He had become simultaneously the symbol of African dignity and the obstacle to Ethiopian progress, a contradiction he could not see or chose to ignore. In 1966, he visited Jamaica, where thousands greeted him as God incarnate, weeping and reaching to touch his car. He was uncomfortable with their worship, but accepted their devotion to. Back in Ethiopia, university students were calling for revolution. The god was aging. His people were losing faith. In 1962, Haile Selassie dissolved Eritrea's federal status and annexed the former Italian colony as a mere province, violating the UN agreement that had joined the territories and igniting a war that would burn for decades. The Eritrean Liberation Front launched armed struggle against Ethiopian rule, and the emperor responded with military campaigns that devastated villages and created refugees who flooded into Sudan carrying stories of atrocities. To fight this war, he expanded and modernized his military with American aid flowing generously to this Cold War ally. But the army he built became a political force of its own. Officers witnessing the corruption of the imperial court, while conscripted peasant boys died in mountains they had never seen for a cause they did not understand. The war drained resources that might have funded schools and hospitals, brutalizing soldiers who returned home changed by what they had done and what they had witnessed. International criticism mounted as reports of Ethiopian repression spread, but the emperor pressed on, determined to hold his expanded empire together regardless of cost. Like the French in Algeria, the Eritrean conflict radicalized the Ethiopian military while exposing the moral bankruptcy of the regime that sent young men to kill and die. Among those serving in the Eritrean campaign was a young major named Mengistu Haile Mariam, who watched soldiers march without shoes while officers drove foreign cars, who saw peasant boys bleeding into foreign soil for an emperor who lived in palaces surrounded by lions and diamonds. He watched. He remembered. And deep within him, something cold began to grow. At Haile Selassie, a university, the emperor's own project of modernization turned against him as students who had benefited from his educational reforms began demanding the changes he refused to make. Land to the tiller became their rallying cry, a slogan that struck at the heart of the feudal system where nobility and church controlled the countryside while peasants labored in conditions unchanged for centuries. Students allied with radical professors, some trained in Marxist thought that provided a framework for understanding Ethiopian inequality, analyzing the emperor's autocracy and the church's vast landholdings through the lens of class struggle. The emperor responded with repression, arrests and expulsions, and occasional violence that only radicalized the movement further, while Ethiopian students abroad in Europe and America grew more militant still. Underground revolutionary groups formed in the shadows, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party and Mason and others, planning transformations the aging monarch could not imagine. Wallalain Mikanen published his explosive essay questioning the imperial unity narrative, challenging everything the emperor had built before dying in a hijacking attempt in 1972. Haile Selassie dismissed these young radicals as ungrateful children, believing his personal prestige and decades of service protected him from serious challenge. He made cosmetic reforms and offered vague promises while refusing any structural change that might threaten the system he embodied. In 1969, he met with student representatives, listening politely, promising consideration, changing nothing. As the students departed, one whispered to another that he did not even understand what they were asking. He was 77 years old. He could not imagine Ethiopia without himself. In 1972, the rains failed in Volo and Tigray provinces, and crops withered in the fields, while livestock collapsed and died. And by 1973, famine had spread across northern Ethiopia with a horror that would shatter an empire. An estimated 40,000 to 80,000 people perished, though some counts suggested 200,000, as peasants flooded into towns seeking food, and roads became lined with corpses that no one had strength to bury. International relief organizations attempted to respond, but the Ethiopian government minimized the crisis, fearing embarrassment on the world stage the emperor had worked so hard to command. In 1973, Haile Selassie hosted the OAU summit in Addis Ababa, presiding over lavish banquets for foreign leaders, while his own people starved in the northern highlands. Officials hid the famine's true extent from the aging monarch, or perhaps he chose not to know. But the obscenity of the contrast became impossible to ignore. Then British journalist Jonathan Dimbleby filmed the unknown famine and broadcast it on ITV. Images of skeletal children with hollow eyes intercut with footage of the emperor feeding meat to his pampered dogs. The film devastated Haile Selassie's international reputation and shattered Ethiopians who had believed in their monarch's benevolence. The military grew openly critical while workers struck and students rioted, and the facade of control crumbled. In his palace, the emperor watched a screening of the documentary, his face revealing nothing as horror unfolded on the screen. When it ended, he rose slowly and left the room in silence. There was nothing to say. The truth was unforgivable. The revolution came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow unraveling that the aging emperor could not comprehend until it was far too late. In January 1974, military units began mutinying over pay and conditions, while taxi drivers struck over fuel prices and teachers and students and workers joined the mounting chaos. In March, Haile Selassie dismissed his cabinet and appointed reformers who raised military pay and promised constitutional changes. But these concessions only convinced the military that the old lion had lost his teeth. By June, a shadowy group of junior officers had formed the Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, soon known as the Derg, and they began arresting former officials on charges of corruption, while the emperor praised their anti-corruption efforts, believing himself still in control of forces that had already slipped beyond his grasp. Through July and August, the Derg arrested more officials, including his closest advisors, seized control of media and communications, and isolated the monarch in his palace, while he remained nominally emperor of a realm that no longer obeyed him. He attempted to co-opt these young officers by accepting every demand, agreeing to constitutional reforms and land reform and everything they asked. But he could not understand that they wanted not reform, but revolution. On September 11, 1974, a delegation of Derg officers arrived at Jubilee Palace and informed the 82-year-old emperor that he was suspended from the throne. He protested that he was constitutionally the source of all authority. They ignored him. He asked to address his people one final time. They refused. On the morning of September 12, 1974, Haile Selassie dressed in his full imperial regalia as if preparing for a state occasion, believing he would be permitted to address his nation and appeal to the loyalty of a people he had ruled for nearly 6 decades. He was wrong. A Volkswagen Beetle arrived at the palace gates, a deliberate humiliation for a monarch accustomed to royal processions, and officers ordered the Emperor of Ethiopia into the cramped back seat. They drove him through streets he had walked as regent and king and emperor, past buildings he had constructed and monuments he had dedicated, to the 4th Division headquarters, where he was placed under arrest, like a common criminal. The Derg broadcast their accusations to a stunned nation: corruption and famine, cover-up and abuse of power, playing clips from Dimbleby's devastating documentary and displaying the gold and jewelry and secret bank accounts that revealed their living god as merely mortal and venal. As he was led to the waiting car, Haile Selassie spoke his last public words, saying that if this was for the good of Ethiopia, he would comply. A statement that reads as either supreme dignity or utter defeat, depending on who tells the story. The Derg proclaimed Ethiopia a socialist state and abolished the monarchy, ending the Solomonic dynasty that claimed 3,000 years of continuity. Churches were stripped of their lands, and nobles arrested or executed as revolutionary violence consumed the nation. That night, the former emperor sat in a small room at military headquarters with no servants, no ceremony, no lions, eating food from a metal tray in silence. Outside, the city celebrated. The god had fallen. For nearly a year, the former emperor existed in a strange twilight between dignity and degradation, held under house arrest first at the 4th Division headquarters, and then within his own grand palace that had become his prison. His family was scattered, arrested and imprisoned or fled into exile, while Derg officers interrogated the old man about hidden assets and international contacts, and his responsibility for the famine that had doomed his reign. He answered their questions with the patience of a monarch, addressing subjects who had forgotten their place, maintaining imperial dignity even as everything imperial was stripped away. Outside his confinement, the Derg consolidated power through blood, internal struggles producing a victor in Mengistu Haile Mariam, who outmaneuvered rivals with ruthless efficiency. In November 1974, 60 former officials were executed by firing squad, and the revolution announced that it would devour anyone who resisted. Land to the tiller became law at last. The reform students had demanded for years, now proclaimed by men with guns. The emperor was 82, then 83, his health deteriorating with minimal medical care, while he refused to renounce his throne or sign any confession of wrongdoing. Guards reported that he spent hours reading his Bible in silence. A man watching everything he built crumble, leaving no memoir, no apology, no explanation. His silence was either his final act of imperial dignity or imperial denial. In August 1975, the Derg announced he was ill and moved him to the basement of the Grand Palace. The announcement was either lie or prophecy. The emperor had only days to live. On August 27, 1975, The Derg announced that Haile Selassie had died of respiratory failure following complications from a prostate operation, a clinical explanation for the end of Africa's oldest monarchy. No autopsy was permitted, and no public funeral held. The body buried secretly in a location that would remain unknown for nearly 2 decades. The official account satisfied no one, and evidence that emerged years later suggested a darker truth. Suffocation by pillow pressed to the face of an 83-year-old man, almost certainly ordered by Mengistu Haile Mariam, who had consolidated absolute power over the Derg. In 1992, after Mengistu fled the country, workers discovered the emperor's remains beneath a latrine near his former office. A final desecration visited upon the man who had once been proclaimed King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Rastafari believers worldwide refused to accept news of the death, many insisting that Haile Selassie lived on spiritually, even as his physical form had been destroyed. The reported death causing theological crisis within a movement that had venerated him as divine. In Ethiopia, public mourning was forbidden, but many grieved in secret, the Derg's mounting brutality making some nostalgic for the flawed monarch they had once despised. The historical irony was complete, for Haile Selassie had spent his life building Ethiopia's international standing only to die in a basement and be buried beneath a latrine, while a regime claiming to represent the people murdered thousands in his name. On the day of his death, the rains fell heavily over Addis Ababa. The same rains that had failed in Volo, that had starved his people, that had destroyed his throne. The revolution that had promised liberation delivered instead a nightmare that would dwarf every horror of the imperial era. Between 1977 and 1978, the Red Terror consumed Ethiopia as the Derg waged war against opposition groups, mass executions, and torture and disappearances, claiming an estimated 500,000 lives, while parents were forced to pay for the bullets that killed their own children. The Eritrean War that Haile Selassie had begun continued now as civil war, joined by rebellions in Tigray and Ogaden and other regions, while Somalia invaded during the chaos only to be defeated with Soviet and Cuban assistance. Mengistu Haile Mariam ruled as absolutely as any emperor, but with none of the legitimacy, persecuting the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and imposing Marxism as the new state religion. Forced collectivization devastated agriculture, and between 1983 and 1985, a famine killed an estimated 1 million people, far worse than the catastrophe that had destroyed Haile Selassie's throne. Ethiopia became a global symbol of African tragedy, its skeletal children haunting television screens worldwide. The bitter ironies multiplied beyond counting, for the revolution that overthrew an emperor for allowing famine killed far more through famine. The revolution that promised land reform created collective farms producing less than feudal estates. The revolution that promised democracy created a totalitarian state. In 1991, rebel forces closed in on Addis Ababa, and Mengistu fled to Zimbabwe, where he remains in exile. The Derg collapsed, and Ethiopia's experiment in revolutionary socialism ended. The cost was millions dead, a generation traumatized, a nation broken. In the year 2000, Haile Selassie finally received the burial denied him for a quarter century, laid to rest at Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa, as thousands attended, including Rastafari pilgrims who flew from Jamaica to honor the man they still revered as divine. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church presided over ceremonies that reunited the emperor with his empress Menen, who had died in 1962, and the nation that had torn down his statues now debated his legacy with passion that showed how deeply he still haunted the Ethiopian imagination. To some, He remained the modernizer who built schools and hospitals, the liberator who returned from exile to free his people, the symbol of African dignity who faced down fascism at the League of Nations. To others, he was the autocrat who crushed dissent, the feudal oppressor who kept peasants in bondage, the man who fed dogs while children starved. The truth encompasses both portraits, and neither more complicated than any simple verdict can contain. The Rastafari movement keeps his image alive across the world, while his palaces have become museums, and his face appears on tourist souvenirs in the city he transformed. Ethiopia today struggles with ethnic conflict and authoritarianism and poverty, and the Eritrean War he began only ended formally in 2018. Young Ethiopians know him as history, while the old remember him as life itself. He was born in a feudal empire, tracing lineage to Solomon, and died in a basement while revolutionaries erased his memory. He warned the world about fascism, and the world refused to listen. "It is us today," he prophesied. "It will be you tomorrow." He was right.